A little bit of background. I'm, like Diego said, currently serving as the Deputy Director for the State of Alabama Emergency Management Agency. I've been in that role for a few years. Prior to that, I was a local emergency manager, also here in Alabama for quite some time in Calhoun County, which is the home of a FEMA training center that's widely known, which is the Center for Domestic Preparedness, located in Anniston, Alabama. They do a lot of first responder type training. It's a really cool facility. So I always mention that because in this field, a lot of people have come through that facility either to get training or with some involvement with FEMA. So it's a pretty neat thing right there in our backyard. I also teach for Jacksonville State University and their emergency management program online. So I have to put a plug in for those guys, and I'm a JSU alum. Background education wise, I actually started out in geography. So my undergraduate degree is a BS in geography, which was a lot of natural hazards, GIS, physical and earth science, that kind of stuff. Very, very general, useful, but also on the human geography side, advanced regional studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the Middle East, both of which have significant homeland security implications from a cultural and societal standpoint. And then I was very fortunate. I was able to do my grad school studies out in Monterey at the Naval Postgraduate School, Center for Homeland Defense and Security. So that's been a really great way to build out a professional network there. So just in terms of what I would like to spend some time talking with you all today, I wanted to frame up sort of the challenges that we've got, in emergency management. And as new entrants into the field professionally, with the exception of Melinda, who obviously is already working in the field, it's important, I think, to kind of understand the frameworks that people will be using to look at their own place in the world, professionally, as well as the place of the profession of emergency management itself kind of in the world. And that really is the fundamental challenge that emergency management is going to have to tackle over the next 10 to 15 years if emergency management is going to remain relevant. Now, I would also point out that while I may talk a lot about just emergency management, it's important to realize that emergency management is not just about what the emergency managers do, but almost everyone has a role in emergency management kind of writ large when we talk about an entire community or an entire society as a system. We're talking about resilience and the ability of our societies to withstand changes, to continue delivering services and sort of function in a normal, expected way, which is already implicit with challenges in terms of inequities. The world is a very complex place. Excuse me. I kind of feel like emergency managers, and to the extent we all have a role in emergency management, really all of us, the job is to keep the world sort of between the ditches. If you think about that's kind of an expression here in the South is, you're driving down the road and it's like, just keep it between the ditches, right? In other words, you can veer to one side or the other, but you don't want to crash. That really is our job. And that involves politics. It involves science, technology, understanding our economy, as well as the environment that we live in and the hazards that are posed in that environment, both from nature itself, as well as, the various kind of human caused things that can go wrong. So in my way of looking at things, which is not, I have no exclusive right to say that my way is right and anything else is wrong. That's not where I'm going. But just for me personally, it helps to understand that, the emergency management function is about keeping things sort of within some sort of established parameters. And then there's a conversation about, well, what should those parameters really be? And that's where the politics comes into it. What are we going to accept and what are we going to try to wrestle with or tackle? And who gets to make the decisions about what the priorities should be, right? All of that is sort of socially defined. We do it through budgeting processes. We do it through political dialogue. The media is involved. There's just a lot of narrative flowing around all the time. And if you're going to be effective doing any kind of crisis management or disaster emergency management work, you kind of have to bear all of that in mind all the time. And it's really tough to find a firm foundation to stand on. So for those of you that are, in the program, I would encourage you to broaden your knowledge to the extent you possibly can. Always try to maintain, as many different competing perspectives as you possibly can, and understand that, not everybody looks at the world the same way. Each of us approaches things from our own particular perspective, our own background and experiences. And in a crisis or a disaster, oftentimes we will find ourselves rushing in to offer help in the way that we think ourselves we would want to be helped. And that is not necessarily how other people might want to receive assistance. And that can manifest, through lots of different processes and systems. You could say, for instance, cultural sensitivity is a thing that we need to be conscious of. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, that the most important thing we can do is engage in a real constructive dialogue with everyone involved, and not take it for granted that we know necessarily what should be done or know how to help people, because we see things, through that very narrow lens. So what I'm going to do today is run through some slides. I know everybody's excited about that. I hate slides, but I do like pictures and visuals. And this is a presentation that I've done several different times, and most recently I had the chance to present out in Idaho at their state conference. And I've got to go up to New York in a couple of months and talk to some emergency managers there. But this is a talk that I gave at the IAEM conference last fall. And what we're going to talk about is a different lens to think about the way the emergency manager approaches his or her work, and the importance that our worldview kind of has on what I was just speaking of, which is our relationship really with our customers, who are in effect the whole world that we're kind of stuck in the middle of. So I'm going to share my screen and run through this. It'll take about 40 minutes or so, and feel free to pause, ask questions. Some of these things I will run through a little more quickly, and others I will dwell on a little bit more. So let's see. I want to make sure that you all can see the screen. Can you see my screen with the slides up now? Okay, great. So if you think about the role of the emergency manager, it's important to always bear in mind that there are two things there at once. The first is the emergency manager herself, the personal characteristics and skills and the knowledge that she brings to the program. And then secondly, there's the program itself, right? Which is, what is the activity that we're doing, and how does it fit into the larger context? Whether that is in a private sector organization, or on a university campus, or in a community or a state, or even at the national level, that program is designed or intended to do, some things that are specific, and may in fact be being relied on to do some things that aren't necessarily well known or even recognized. So we're going to talk about a couple of different models in terms of strategic management and how that bears into the crisis management work. And then we're going to talk about a third way of looking at things that's a little bit new and different. So I like this quote. This is from a guy named Mark Moore, and he says that the strategic problem for public managers really is how to imagine and articulate a vision of public value that can command legitimacy and support, but that is also operationally doable. All right, so what he's talking about there is we need to figure out as emergency managers, what is the value proposition? What are we supposed to be bringing back out to the rest of society? How do we show worth? How can we articulate that and communicate it in a way that gives us the credibility and the resources we need to be successful? And we also have to keep it realistic and sort of down to earth that, we're not talking about saving the world, but these are things that we can actually accomplish that are achievable and measurable. And so you really have to balance all three of those. And when you think about the tasks that the emergency manager performs, we really put things into like 4 buckets, okay? There are tasks that by rights, we need to do them, right? In other words, as a community, you need to have sort of an emergency plan in place. You need to be doing training. You need to do planning and exercises, those sorts of things. There are also things that we might want to do that are sort of optional or may not. In other words, nobody's necessarily asking us to do these things. There's not a requirement for us to do them, but they're good things to do. So those are kind of the 2 sides to the same coin on the day-to-day stuff. But beneath all of that, there are activities that are sort of just implied that we just have to do, right? Like in an organization, people have to be paid. Somebody's taking care of paying the bills. You have to have support systems in place. It's kind of like if you need to get up in the morning and go to work, well, you have to get dressed, and you have to actually get in a car and get there, which means there are a lot of other things that have to happen. You have to have gas money, you got to have a car, all that. We don't really think about those things in emergency management in terms of how we enable our programs to be successful. And then when there is a crisis or a disaster or some type of emergency, there are things that we're called on to do that we absolutely must do, right? So when you think about all the stuff that an emergency manager does in her day job, just think about it through that lens of what's the requirement here? Why are we doing this? Is it optional, or is it something that we're required to do? Is it just a necessity of circumstances, or is it something that we're doing just as our, kind of the implied behind the scenes stuff that we've got to do? So, and I know you guys have heard from, many other really, really smart people, a lot smarter than me, about various threats and climate change and demographics and this sort of stuff. But just remember, emergency management programs are constantly changing. There is never going to be a point, if you're working in this field, where you can sort of sit back and say, well, we did it, we're done, and everybody's prepared, and we can walk away from it, because the threats are constantly evolving. People are moving in and out, people get promoted, they retire, communities grow, communities shrink. Priorities are going to continuously be in flux based on what's going on in the world. And then things happen that you just don't expect. We also have limited resources. There's only so much time and money and people to go around, and that's what we have to work with. So you have to prioritize. It is not optional. You must prioritize how you're going to spend your time. And that can be a real drain on emergency managers, because it can seem as if there's just too much to do. And it can be really hard to work in the profession when you feel like you don't have the support or the resources you need to really be effective. So I'm sure you all know about what we call the 4 phases model, right? So are y'all familiar with the preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery kind of 4 phases? Somebody, yeah. So that's kind of like the gospel in emergency management, and it has been really since the 1980s when FEMA rolled out something called comprehensive emergency management, this all hazards kind of idea. And as you look around, we tend to put things into those four buckets, or we want to, like mentally, and a lot of the guidance and the doctrine and the material is based around that. But it's really not something that makes sense, because you're never really done preparing. Response and recovery are really sort of the same thing. That at a minimum, they're connected, and there's not a clear boundary between them. So that's problematic. We also have to think about, the fact of how we are seen by the other people that we work with, our partners and our stakeholders, how we interact with that network of people versus everybody that's not in the network. So what I'm referring to there is that you've got to build relationships with other public safety professionals, with your bosses, with the government, but you also have to deal with the rest of the world that doesn't even really know you're there until you sort of show up and they need you, right? So you have to maintain that balance, and that's tough. Then we also have a challenge of needing to constantly build an organization around us that is kind of that program element that I was talking about. It's bigger than just the person, but the organization has to be adaptable and it has to be flexible. So you're building a system that is not necessarily keyed into just one way of looking at things, but it should be able to take on any circumstance, work through a set of processes, and get things back into balance quickly. And then beneath all of that, there are, in fact, expectations of what it should look like. So we do have guidance, and we do have doctrine, and there are laws and regulations and standards about the way things are done. But it's tough to expect that to be achieved like at the level of an individual, right? So no one person can know or do everything. So we have to capture our compliance with those expectations across the whole program. And that's really tough, because as human beings, what we want to do psychologically is ask each individual to kind of be everything. But that's just not how things work. So it's important to be conscious of that in terms of where the responsibilities are being shared across the people through the whole large system. So I mentioned the 4 phases, right? It's important to understand that most emergency managers sort of take it for granted that the preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery is what we do, but they're not really outcomes, okay? They are activities. There's not a point at which you can measure and say, all right, we've mitigated the whole situation and we're done, or we're completely done responding, or we're completely done recovering, because the environment after whatever has happened is going to be different. And as a result of that, you're going to have to sort of start over. So we also have this thing called resilience. And if y'all would, have you guys had conversation about resilience? Is that a word that has sort of come up in your presentations? Does anybody know what that means? Does anybody here want to volunteer a definition for resilience? I would love to hear maybe just kind of what your impression is.
Kind of the ability to bounce back after a disaster, and how much they're able to kind of recover in a timely fashion.
I think that's pretty good. The ability to bounce back, that probably is about an accurate definition as we can give it. And that can also be on the organizational level. It can be on the individual level. We talk about like emotional resilience or psychological resilience. It can be on a level of economics. So it's the ability of a system or person, which is still a system, to withstand some kind of a shock and to come out of that where it's still adapted and connected to, the environment, I think. So what does that got to do with emergency management? Well, we talk about resilience a lot, but we haven't really done a good job mapping it to our day-to-day. It's easy to say that resilience is in the mitigation space, because you can look at something like a piece of infrastructure and say, pretty much concretely, how can we add to or improve it in such a way that makes it less vulnerable to being, taken out or failing. It's a lot more difficult to look at a community, which is made up of people, and say, well, how do we make the community more resilient? Well, first off, a lot of people are going to have different opinions on what the community even is, or how they view the community, or moreover, what it should be. So when you talk about community resilience, it's more about that preparedness idea, right? It's how do you ask people to be more resilient? How do you ask them to be more responsible for themselves? Well, they may have different opinions about that. Some people may think, hey, it's not my job to be prepared for myself. I need the insurance company to help me, or I want the government to assist. Others may say, sure, I'll take this on. And nobody gets to say which is the right or wrong approach. And in fact, it usually turns out to be, a balance of a lot of different ways to that. And there's also not there's no place in the 4 phases model that takes care of all this day-to-day kind of behind the scenes stuff we have to do. So if you're thinking emergency management is like, okay, we're going to prepare, respond, mitigate, recover. Well, where's the bill paying? Or having your facilities in place and all the rest of that. It's just not really part of that. It sort of supports everything. So if those are activities, then we need to think about what are the outcomes. Stakeholder readiness is one piece of this, and this is based on a lot of conversations that I've had over the years, versus the more community resilience. So when you think about what are stakeholders would be the partner organizations that you're working with every day. More of the kind of closed systems in terms of, all right, let's just say, for instance, you're an emergency manager in a county and you've got a couple of cities, you've got a number of fire departments, police departments, school districts, right? You can sort of map all that out. Those would all be the stakeholders. But that's a different thing from the community at large, because the communities, you don't really know the community personally. It's constantly in flux. And that's where the resilience piece sort of really comes into play, right? That the stakeholders exist to take care of the community, right? So it would be different to say that you have resilient stakeholders is not the same thing as saying you have a resilient community, right? The stakeholders are part of the overall community resilience, if that makes sense. There's also the question about, how do we measure things? Can you measure resilience? A lot of people would say you can't. I would say that you can, in the sense of you can sort of estimate whether or not a community is going to be able to withstand a particular shock. You're not going to be able to do it quantitatively, but you can easily say for a community, okay, there are lots of vulnerabilities and they don't have the financial resources or social vulnerability, whatever, in a way that it lets you kind of map out how you think they're going to weather a shock. Readiness can be much more easily measured than preparedness. So preparedness, again, as an activity, right? We're constantly preparing. But what is readiness? Readiness is setting a definite target for your preparedness efforts to say, all right, we want, just as an example, in a fire department, we want all of our supervisors in the fire department to have had, this particular training course. Well, that's something that you can easily measure. And then you can monitor that so that as people drop out or new people come in, you know that your readiness has decreased because a certain percentage don't have that skill or that training. So that's very, very different from the community resilience kind of approach, which is a lot more kind of gray area stuff. Let me skip forward here. So what does all that got to do with emergency management? we've got to figure out the relationship between, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then our ability to do that, which is a function of the resources. The why is about, the reasons behind it and the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve. So think about what I said earlier. You have certain laws and rules and regulations that say you must do, particular kinds of activities. Everybody would agree that it's a great thing to go out in a community and try to educate people about hazards, as an example, or perhaps about the need for insurance and this kind of stuff. But it's not likely that that's going to be spelled out in black and white, in any plan or in a law or regulation. The law or regulation says just go take care of people. So all of that balances out. I talked earlier, the quote that we started out with, okay? How do we create public value, right? How do people see what we do as something that's worthwhile and that we can get support from, in terms of they know that we might be needed? And how does that relate to the actual support we get in terms of funding or attention, recognition, whatever the things are that we need to be successful? So take all that on one side, and then you think about, all right, what are we actually doing on a day-to-day basis in terms of trying to get to particular outcomes? And are we really doing the most effective things, or are we just kind of spinning our wheels and running in circles? All right, so I referenced that quote. If you map the quote out, what you get is those 3 points in a large triangle, which is called the strategic triangle. And this is a kind of a model for looking at how you manage things in the public sector to get what you need to get the job done. So you've got 3 bubbles here. The legitimacy and support would equate to what some would call your authorizing environment, right? So if you go back and you look at a particular law or a statute that creates emergency management, in this example, that is part of your ability to just exist and do things. But it also includes the political support. There are a lot of things like laws on the books that say, hey, we need to have particular programs in place, but if they're not, if nobody's paying attention to it, then it's not going to get done. So you don't have the legitimacy you need to accomplish those things. Then you think about what's the value that you're actually trying to provide out there. And that is really what other people are going to get out of it, right? In other words, how they're going to link into what you're doing, how they're going to be able to rely on what you're doing and depend on you to be there, that you're going to provide something that they might need. And then lastly, your capacity to just actually get stuff done, which is a function of people, equipment, facilities, time, and most importantly, the money that you need to do that. And I'm going to flip through these because I just reviewed all of those sort of in summary. So as the emergency manager, you kind of have to float at the middle of those 3 bubbles all the time, right? And I'm thinking about the scenario that Diego was talking about that you are all working on. And in that sort of imaginary environment, what legitimacy and support do you have? Are you going to be able to accomplish anything beyond that? Well, no, certainly, because a lot of times you'll hear that characterized as being outside your lane. That's something that people talk about all the time in emergency management. Is like, you're trying to get into something or an area that's not really, you don't have a right to, or you're not expected to. Stay in your lane, kind of thing. That's when you're bumping into that part of the bubble. Then you've got the public value piece. Is what you're doing worthwhile? Is it needed? Is it really meeting the need or the expectation that's out there? And then lastly, that issue about your capacity to do it. Do you really have the stuff you need to get it done? And how do you get there? So with this particular chart, I know that this is kind of like really esoteric and hard to read, but the general idea is that the more legitimacy and support you have, the more autonomy you're going to have, but you also have to have public value to go along with it that actually increases your impact in addition to the resources. So all that boils down very simply to 3 questions. Understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And that's a really, really important question about why. Okay, why does it matter? Why should we do whatever we're doing? How are we able to do it in terms of our capacities and resources? And then lastly, what difference does it make, right? How are you going to know that you've made a difference? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to capture that and then use that as a foundation for moving forward, right? And that is sort of really important, because when you're thinking about, like, for instance, a disaster recovery program, you'll notice that they're oftentimes measured in terms of dollars. We made a difference because these dollars moved. Well, is that the only way to measure that? You know, if you're working in a nonprofit or a faith-based organization and you're out there dealing with a disaster survivor, they may tell you emotionally, hey, I appreciate the things that you've done. But how can you capture that? That's almost impossible to do, but we absolutely have to do that. So really what we're talking about there is the reason for what we're doing, our ability to do it, and then that last piece, the outcome. So take that and sort of put it in the parking lot. We're going to talk about a completely different way of looking at things, which is internal to the kind of the organization that you would be working in. This is from somebody named Aidan Vining. What Vining's contribution was to take something from the strategic business management literature called the 5 Forces framework. And the 5 Forces framework is something that's used to compare corporations in terms of which might have a strategic advantage over others, right? And there are 5 components to that. And we're thinking about competition here, right? So the first is supplier power, which is essentially how are you getting the resources you need? The second is your ability to buy. In other words, your ability to get support, your ability to get attention. The risk posed by other people coming in to your business field and competing with you directly for those resources. The risk of being made irrelevant or being substituted for something else. In other words, you're just not needed anymore at all. And then lastly, there's the balance and rivalry component, because you're going to have a certain amount of your bandwidth is going to kind of be cleaned off the top, because it's just, you're dealing with crap. You're dealing with constant conflict and competition just in the overall environment. So it's, in other words, that's a way of saying no matter what you're doing, you're never going to be 100% efficient at doing that anywhere. In fact, probably nowhere close to that. You're always going to be waiting some of your time. So in adapting that to the public sector, remember the 5 Forces framework is about corporate competition. If you adapt that to government, what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. Really, there are 2 dimensions. It's about how much money you have and how much influence you have in setting your own priorities, which we call policy. Okay. So it's about essentially dollars and your ability to control your own destiny in terms of your activities that you're actually accomplishing. So if you map those out, you get 4 sectors. If you have a lot of money and you have a lot of policy autonomy, then basically you're completely free to do whatever you want. All right. If you don't have any money, but you have a lot of autonomy, then that might be really nice, but you're not going to accomplish anything because you don't have the ability to do it. You can also have a lot of money, but very little freedom, which would be called a golden handcuff, right? So you can be working in a program where you've got tons and tons of money, but very little flexibility to deliver any kind of outcome or result that is needed. And you can also have no money and no freedom, which essentially at that point means you're a victim of circumstances and you're completely stuck. So if you look at emergency management, there are definite parallels here to this matrix. All right. If you look at your larger counties and your more urban areas, they tend to have more well-resourced emergency management programs. They get more money, they get more attention, and they also have a lot more flexibility and freedom to do things. There are also programs that have a lot of money, but don't have hardly any flexibility because they're very tightly constrained by the regulatory environment. An example of that would be REP, which is the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program. So if you look around the country at like our nuclear power plant communities, they receive special funding for emergency preparedness, but they also have very tight restrictions on what those funds can be spent for. They can't be done, spent for doing just anything. On the other hand, you've got communities that don't have a lot of money to put into emergency management, but they also have a lot of autonomy. That's most of your smaller rural average community level emergency management programs. Nobody really cares what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They just sort of have freedom to do what they think is right, but they don't have a lot of funds or resources to get stuff done. And then at the state level, they really don't have any flexibility because generally speaking, they're not well funded and they're very tightly restricted in what they do have to execute specific programs, because in the United States, most of your state emergency management level organizations deal primarily with FEMA stuff and FEMA grants. Now, why does any of that matter at all? Your autonomy and your ability to set your own destiny is inversely proportional with the level of influence you have. All right. What does that mean? The less someone cares about what you're doing, the more freedom you're going to have. But also, the less someone cares about what you're doing, the less resources they are going to give you to do it, right? Which in emergency management simply means this: if people are not interested in you, in your program, then you're going to have a lot of freedom and flexibility, but you're also not going to have the resources that you need to get anything done. In a disaster or a crisis, when suddenly everyone is interested, you're going to have a lot of resources at your disposal, but your flexibility and your ability to make decisions is going to diminish vastly because suddenly everybody's looking at you and they all have different expectations. That's something that's really different about emergency management that most people don't think about. So when you move from a day-to-day sort of everything is calm environment into that crisis mode, your ability to maneuver is diminished greatly. And that is often taken for granted. And, suddenly politicians and members of the community who 2 weeks before didn't even know that you existed are now telling you what to do, essentially. And that can be a real shock. So how can we get in front of all that on a day-to-day basis and figure out how we build a system to accomplish that? Well, if we go back to our 4 buckets that we created earlier, and we think about the things that we have to do, the things that we want to do, things that we need to do, and then the operational stuff that just kind of gets put on our plate, you can map those out like this. At the bottom, you've got your day-to-day support systems. In the middle, you've got your stakeholder readiness and community resilience efforts. And then when something bad happens, you go into operations and you start tackling the specific problem. So how does that map to the 4 phases model? Well, as we talked earlier, the stakeholder readiness and community resilience really are just different ways of looking at preparedness and mitigation. Operations is just response plus recovery. All right. And then, as we mentioned, there's not a phase that captures the kind of behind the scenes day-to-day support system stuff. So let's look at each of these a little bit more closely. And I think that this will help make it a little more clear. What is stakeholder readiness? Well, the first thing is that it's a closed audience. So if you think about making a map of the network, When you're talking about stakeholder readiness activities, those are things like planning, organizing, equipping, training, exercising, and you can associate a name and a phone number with all of those things, right? In other words, you could potentially map out like every police officer, every firefighter, every person who has a specific role to play in any particular plan. You can capture all of that. It's knowable. It is something that is closed, and you can kind of draw a circle around it. These things are also very centralized. So this is the traditional area where the emergency manager in the community or the organization is standing at the center of the network and very tightly coordinating all of these activities. It's very highly planned, it's very highly structured, and this is where most emergency management actually started, because its background is from military and civil defense type stuff that we really took in the 40s and 50s and turned into what we now know as emergency management. All right, and that's a very important point. And this is something that Diego and I were talking about a little bit earlier. Most emergency management people come from one of two backgrounds. They either will come from a paramilitary, which could mean prior public safety or actual military background, that's very structured, very directed, or they come from some other field. And oftentimes in the emergency management community, you'll find a tension that exists between people who want to structure stuff versus those who are more touchy-feely and kind of warm fuzzy and less so. So what does that look like? Well, touchy-feely means simply that it's an open audience. The community resilience, how it's different from stakeholder readiness, is that you don't really have the ability to map it out. It's kind of broadcast, you throw it out there, it's constantly in motion. You can't wrap your arms around it. You just kind of throw spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. The activities you're doing for community resilience in your public outreach and education are just thrown out there, right? An example would be taking out an advertisement on the TV, right? So you don't know who saw it. You don't know how effective it was. You're just spending those resources and hopefully it sticks, right? Hopefully you make a difference. You can come back later and try to measure it, but you're never going to be able to go to like each individual in the community, knock on their door and say, hey, did you get the message, right? We also talk about like public policy. How do you change people's opinion on a large level about stuff, right? Like maybe we shouldn't build in floodplains, those kind of things. Those are influence activities. They're not things that you can control. These things tend to be very decentralized. So, it's not something where the emergency manager essentially can step into the middle and start making decisions. You have to do your engagement in this space strictly through influence. And it's almost impossible to measure how effective you are going to be at this. But if you're going to be an effective emergency manager, you have to be able to operate this way. So think about the kind of skills that you would need if you're going to be dropped into a community and told, all right, go develop relationships with all the nonprofit and religious organizations in your community, because they're going to be critical to helping you recover from a crisis if it ever happens. Well, the skill set that you would need to do that, to approach those organizations, to get their buy-in, to get their support, are very different skills from what you would need in this other space, right? I can sit down at a table and map out very directly what kind of training program I want to have for my responders. And if I've got the authority to do that, then I can just simply execute it, right? Very structured, very kind of military way, very different from this other space, which is basically marketing, right? It's dealing with a community that's very complex, very diverse, and we don't do a good job training emergency managers in how to operate and be effective in this space. But it's crucial that we do that. You have to be able to balance both sides of that. And I personally know, a lot of emergency managers who struggle in this area because they feel as though they need permission or authority to go out and build those relationships, right? But that's the gray area stuff that actually makes disaster recovery possible, because in reality, you always have to have both of these things going on at once. All right. So I want to pause there before I go on any further and just ask if anybody has any questions or feedback, because I know that was a lot of stuff really quickly, and this is kind of the most important piece that we wanted to focus on.
I just want to say this is probably the most intellectually challenging presentation that we have had so far. So, but keep pushing them, Jonathan.
Okay, gotcha. Well, like I said, I know it's a lot. So let's keep rolling through. We're almost through this. All right, we talked about operations. Operations is simply the stuff you have to do when something bad happens. And I sort of was just talking about this, right? That you, as an emergency manager in your system, in your organization, you have a 24/7, 365 kind of trigger that's waiting to engage in a crisis whenever something gets put on your plate. And that is both something that you're going to handle with some organized plans and procedures, as well as with these looser, more general relationships that you can't really control. So you have to be able to have both ends of those pairs of opposites to be able to move through that piece of it. And then lastly, we talked about, what are the support systems? Well, it's your policies, your strategies, anything that's concrete that you're using, right? Money, equipment, processes, stuff that you can document. That stuff is always there. It never goes away. And you can't do anything without it because that provides the structure that you use to be able to operate both in blue sky and in a crisis. So then you think about resource management. If you're an emergency manager in an organization, where are you going to spend your time? And where are you going to spend your money? You have to put it into one of these four kind of buckets, right? You've got to have your support systems resourced first. You're going to have a certain amount of time and bandwidth spent doing readiness and resilience activities until a crisis happens. And then those things have to stop or slow down so that you can then put resources into operations. And really, this is what you wind up with. Okay. You get a totally different lens of looking at the work of the emergency manager from the four phases, right? And that's the whole key, that for 30 years, we've been training emergency managers to do response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness, but we've not talked about how those outcomes cause us to deal with different communities, different skill sets, and approaching folks. And really what this model does is it frames it up more by the audience that you're dealing with and whatever the situation is in terms of outcome rather than activity. Okay, so that's the difference with this particular approach. So I will stop there and see if anybody's mind is not completely blown enough so that we might have some conversation or discussion about that.
Well,
so let me ask a question then to the audience. If you think about, you're going to be an emergency manager and you go into a community, what are some of the skills that you feel like you would need to have to build relationships?
I think a big one would be being a people person. It's hard to connect with people if people don't like you, and it's hard to build trust, especially in a smaller community, if people don't like you. Because if you go out to go ask for donations to do XYZ or for volunteers, and they don't like you or don't respect you or don't think you're like authoritative enough and can do your job, it's going to be hard to function and do your job fully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, frames up for a great follow-up question, which is how do you get people to like you?
I think
Be
show-
empathetic.
yeah.
Malia, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, showing empathy, being able to be empathetic and put yourself in other people's shoes.
What do you guys think about how do we know when it's appropriate to be empathetic and to what extent? And what are some things that might prevent you from being as empathetic as you might otherwise want to be?
I think it's your morals and like your amount of money that you have to be able to contribute to the community as a whole.
What else do you think fits into that? Because what I hear you saying, Jonathan, is that, you know, as a professional, you might care and you might want to help, but you just might not have the resources to do it, right? So how do we deal with that?
I think maybe that comes into where being a people person outside of the community, of going to the neighboring communities, talking with them, talking with the state, talking with federal agencies to go, hey, we don't have the resources we're going to need to do X, Y, Z. Can you give us a hand? Can you assist us in whatever capacity you're able to?
So like building a coalition of support and putting a team together to help you in your cause. Is that what you're talking about, Wes?
Yes, sir.
So how do we train people to do that? So that really is the kind of the whole point of, you know, this presentation is you go to FEMA's website, right? And you take all these classes and you read all these policy documents, and they're all really telling you have to do the same thing, which is just get everybody to like you and back you up and everything will be fine, right? Like it's as if that were simple. Okay, but we don't necessarily do a good job actually enabling people with skills or resources to help them do that. In fact, we probably do more to hold them back, right? Because we try to overplan things or we make things too structured. And that's really my area of interest. When we talk about engaging in communities that are diverse, that have very different values, getting people to like you and building support become really, really hard things to accomplish, right? You know, I'm a middle-aged white male from Alabama. You know, there are going to be communities in which I'm not going to be seen as credible, right? So as the emergency manager, you have to constantly be thinking about that. Who's the appropriate messenger, right? How do you get maximum engagement from all the audiences that you have to work with, which is that whole community, you know, kind of system.